All righty, good afternoon. Good to see everyone here today. I know it's a crowded room, a little hot, but hopefully have a lively discussion to keep us all energized. My name is Michael Cook. I'm a political consultant here in Little Rock. I'm also a film critic for Channel 4 and 16, so those are my two things I love to talk about, movies and politics. I'm excited that we have Katherine Stewart here today. Unfortunately, Katherine wasn't able to join us in person, but she was able to join us virtually. A few things before we begin. There'll be, toward the end of the program, there'll be time for questions from the audience, so please be thinking of things you'd like to ask. Katherine will have you either stand up at the microphone here or we'll pass it around depending on if you can make it up there or not, because we want to hear from you. Just to get started, let me first start off by saying that Katherine's participation in the Six Bridges Book Festival is made possible by the John David Coulter Memorial Fund. I think, is John's wife, Laura, here with us? I know she was here earlier, but we want to thank her and the Coulter family. The Central Arkansas Library System is honored to have the opportunity to honor John and his love of reading for this program, and just a sense of how small Arkansas is. I knew John, his brother Nate is here, and Laura's mother was my favorite history teacher in high school, so we're all connected somehow in this state, one way or the other. I'd like to read a brief bio of our guest, Katherine Stewart, just to kind of give everybody a sense of her impressive career and the things that she has done. Katherine Stewart has spent more than 16 years investigating one of the most powerful forces in America, the rise of the anti-democratic movement rooted in religious nationalism. Her new book, which we're here to talk about today, Money, Lies, and God, Inside the Movement to Destroy American Democracy, is a New York Times bestseller that pulls back the curtain on how money, media, and religious influence are reshaping our politics. Katherine is also the author of The Power Worshippers, Inside the Dangerous Rise of Religious Nationalism, which won top awards from the Religion News Association and the Morris B. Forkasher's Best Book Award, and became the basis of the documentary God and Country, produced by Rob Reiner. Her earlier book, The Good News Club, the Christian Right's Stealth Assault on America's Children, exposed efforts to undermine public education and the church-state separation. Finally, Katherine's work has appeared in the New York Times, The Atlantic, The New Republic, The Guardian, and many other publications. She's written extensively about religious freedom, science education, the Supreme Court, and the intersection of faith and politics. Please welcome me in welcoming Katherine Stewart to our program today. Katherine, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you so much.
Glad you're here.
I want to say I'm really honored to join with you today. I'm so grateful to the organizers of Six Bridges and, of course, the supporters and every single one of you making time for this conversation today. Thank you so much, Michael, for agreeing to be in conversation with me.
Excellent, excellent. Well, if I can just sort of jump right in, I have a whole list of questions. I read the book with excitement, and I have too many questions. We can't get to them all today because the book was just fascinating. But let's start off with the most basic one is, the title of your latest book, Money, Lies, and God. Can you break down the reason for that title? Kind of give us an overview of the book for those who haven't had a chance to read it yet.
Thank you so much. Well, I titled my book Money, Lies, and God because first, money is a huge part of the story. It's a big part of the anti-democratic movement, an enormous driver of it, meaning that really huge concentrations of wealth have destabilized our political system in some pretty interesting ways. And I'll get to that in a minute. Second, lies or conscious disinformation, propaganda is another huge feature of this movement. And number three, God, because the most important ideological framework for the largest part of this movement is religious nationalism or Christian nationalism. So first, in Money, Lies, and God, I pay very close attention, as you know, to the funders, a sector of a very wealthy, look, America has a lot of very wealthy people. Not all of them are funding this movement, but there is a sector, a subgroup that is pouring their money into the infrastructure of an anti-democratic movement. The interesting thing about these funders is religiously, they're all over the place, but they agree on one thing, which is the need to crush liberalism and what they call the so-called administrative state, which is the functions of an effective working government that, is meant to be of the people, by the people, and for the people. But, a lot of people are going to be hurt if they succeed in destroying a public administration subject to ethics rules and constraints. And that's where the lies in the title fits in. There have been these massive propaganda campaigns to inculcate fear in a lot of Americans, to think they're being victimized by a woke elite or a deep state, and that any political opposition right now to the sort of MAGA agenda is literally demonic or satanic or anti-patriotic, right? I feature some of these engines of conspiracism in my book, Money, Lies, and God. And for instance, Reawaken America, which is a sort of traveling roadshow that takes place in mega churches around the country, each one drawing thousands of participants, which really leads to the religious nationalism piece of this picture. I would say Christian nationalism is arguably the single most important piece of the anti-democratic reaction, in that it's an ideology or a political machine that motivates a lot of voters or local activists, people I refer to as the foot soldiers of the movement. Many of them might not themselves identify as Christian nationalist, and with their votes, when they say cast the vote to protect the American family, for instance, or end abortion, they're not really arguing for major changes in the way our government is run. They're really making a statement about what they value in themselves, right? Their themselves and their identity, but with their actions or with their votes, they end up lending support to a religious nationalist agenda.
Very good, very good. And, kind of getting into some definitions here, you kind of touched on Christian nationalism. And then also in the book, you talk about the new right. Can you kind of give us an overview of how those two are the same and the different and how they're aligned?
Thank you so much. Christian nationalism is not just an ideology. Well, it is an ideology and it's also a political movement. I think of it as a mindset and also a machine. To, boil it down to its bare bones, the ideology says that America was founded as a Christian nation according to a certain interpretation of the Bible, and our laws should be based on the Bible. And we sort of lost that. That's what made America great. We need to get back to that. Any opposition to that agenda is sort of anti-American. But it's also a kind of, I would say, political movement, an anti-democratic political movement. The movement is leadership driven. The agenda is not set by the rank and file, it's set by the leaders of the movement. And it's also organization driven. There's been, over the past 5, 6 decades, billions of dollars, literally, that have poured into this development of this movement, this machine, and into these various organizations. And we can divide the organizations into categories. There are right-wing policy groups. I'll throw out a few names, but this is by absolutely no means comprehensive. There are right-wing policy groups like the American Family Association or the Family Research Council. There are legal advocacy groups that include, I would say, the Alliance Defending Freedom and First Liberty, and Pacific Justice Institute. There are networking organizations like the Council for National Policy that get leaders of these different organizations together, get them sort of coordinated in their actions, and then bring them together with deep-pocketed funders of the movement. There are think tanks like Heritage, there's just so many, the Claremont Institute, which I would say is less explicitly religious nationalist, but also has become very anti-democratic, and some of its contributors are explicitly religious nationalist and some are not. There's a sort of vast messaging sphere, a kind of parts of which function as like a sort of fact-free propaganda sphere. And there are very sophisticated data initiatives. And I think an underappreciated feature of the movement are these pastoral initiatives that I describe in my books, Money, Lies, and God, and The Power Worshippers. These organizations have names like Faith Wins and Watchmen on the Wall. They draw hundreds or even thousands of pastors, or Church United, hundreds or even thousands of pastors together. They give them presentations in different areas, often in swing districts and swing states. I've attended some of these gatherings where, one was attended by several hundred pastors, another by several dozen, several of them by several dozen. Leaders of the movement will give these pastors their marching orders. They'll say, it's your biblical duty to turn out your congregations to vote for biblical values, which are never about like serving the poor and helping the least of these and, cultivating, empathy for your neighbor. It's really more about ending abortion, ending same-sex marriage, protecting a certain idea of what religious liberty is, which is the right of people with supposedly correct religious beliefs to discriminate against those of whom they disapprove. And they give them very sophisticated tools for turning out their congregations to vote. They give them, at one gathering I attended, thousands, tens of thousands of voter guides were being distributed and, put into these pastors' cars so they could distribute them to their congregations, or videos to air at church. They have very sophisticated data tools. So I think that sometimes, these things are easier to understand when we see them happening in other countries. When you see a leader like Vladimir Putin in Russia, or Viktor Orban in Hungary, or Erdogan in Turkey, or leaders in Iran, when you see these leaders bind themselves very tightly to ultra-conservative religious figures in their own countries to consolidate a more authoritarian form of political power, we rightly recognize that as a form of religious nationalism. And those countries, there are nuances specific to different countries. Those countries aren't necessarily, look, they're theocratic in a certain fake sense. They have an official religion. They try to impose those religious values on everybody in the country, but they're more accurately described, I would say, as cronyistic, kleptocratic autocracies with absolute suppression of free speech and political opposition. And the role of religion, that sort of, bubble wrapping, these leaders bubble wrapping themselves in sanctimony, is really critical because it makes it harder to sort of attack or I would say investigate these leaders for the abuses they're perpetrating against their own people and the ways in which they're abusing power. So that's the religious right piece of it. I'm sorry, it's a little complicated. And the new right is, I would say, less explicitly religious nationalist. As I mentioned, some of this movement sort of has congregated around certain think tanks. A lot of representatives of the new right are represented in the Trump administration. Many of them contributed to Project 2025. I wish I could see a show of hands. I'm going to ask those of you who have heard of Project 2025 to raise your hands. And Michael, you can tell me how many.
I think everybody in the audience has heard of.
Oh, great. This is
Every hand
amazing.
goes up.
So, a lot of representatives of Project 2020, of the New Right were contributors to Project 2025. I see that document as a kind of collaboration between the religious right and the New Right, these two features I call the power couple of American authoritarianism. So it's explicit, I would say overall, the New Right is less explicitly religious nationalist, but more explicitly anti-democratic. And they've sort of promoted this idea that they want to smash the administrative state. What does that mean? What is an administrative state and how do you smash it? This is something we've heard over and over from Russell Vought, who is our current president's head of Office of Management and Budget. Well, it's a dismantling of the institutions of a functioning working democracy. We saw a lot of that smashing and chainsaw attacks when Elon Musk, an unelected billionaire, and his 22-year-old minions went on a rampage through the federal government, slashing and burning and cutting jobs and firing people who handled the nuclear safety codes, et cetera, et cetera. So that is this power couple in a nutshell.
That's great. That's great. One thing in the beginning of the book is a phrase that I thought went throughout the whole book that I'd like you kind of to define for us. It's reactionary nihilism. What do you mean by that phrase in the book, in that theme?
I think of nihilism as a description of those people whose fundamental aim is to destroy rather than create, a sort of that impulse to destroy rather than create. Not just nihilism is that sort of destructive impulse. And the people who adhere to it, I call these folks uh, nihilists because through their actions rather than by what they're saying, they're denying that there's any real truth or value in the world as it exists, right? They're always talking about how broken and horrible our country is thanks to, I don't know, the woke mob or whatever that means to them, the principles of equality, the fact of American pluralism, etc. By reactionary, I mean that rather than advancing or progressing toward a better state, this movement emphasizes a return to some kind of fantasy, imaginary version of an allegedly better past that never really existed the way they think it did, but it's also a past that includes elements of a regressive social order, such as gender hierarchy, the suppression of sometimes racial hierarchies, suppression of certain forms of speech, attacks on the religious freedom of those who fail to conform, among other features. So I put these two words together to describe the anti-democratic movement. Now, let's be really clear. Not everyone who wants to go to the good old days and sort of hankers for the sort of ideas of a peaceful, distant past or simpler distant past is a nihilist. We all sometimes long for the good old days, right? But the ones who believe that a democratic, and I have certain aspects of the good old days, maybe not others, but those who believe that a democratic political system and its ideals and institutions are so bad that they need to be destroyed, and at the same time, they're exalting a completely fictitious fantasy about a time past. Those folks, I would say, count as nihilists. Their vision is not based on reality. It's retreating into a fantasy that's projected onto the past.
That's great. Catherine, what are some of the biggest misconception people have about this movement?
Well, I think the biggest misconception has long been this idea that it's just about the culture wars. And if we just give way on abortion or same-sex marriage, they'll be happy and they'll go away. And I think that's really wrong. This movement is not driven. I mean, some of those social policy preferences are present, to be sure, but it's not entirely driven by that. I think it's related to a kind of historical misconception. A lot of folks think that this movement came together around the abortion issue. They think that the rank and file rose up en masse in response to the 1973 decision, passage of Roe versus Wade. But in fact, the movement came together really in the late 1970s and early 1980s around an entirely different issue. The thing that really animated the folks in this movement in that time, it was a movement that they called themselves also the New Right. It was sort of activated by folks like Paul Weyrich and Howard Phillips and Phyllis Schlafly. What really got them going in the morning was a kind of racist like opposition to school segregation, to Brown versus Board of Education. But there were other social issues they were concerned around, but they only latched on to abortion after considering some other issues. We have to remember that in 1973, most Protestant Republicans supported liberalization of abortion laws. And we have to remember that it was Ronald Reagan who signed the most liberal abortion bill into law in I believe it was 67. In 1971 and 1974, the Southern Baptist Convention published editorials hailing liberalization of abortion law. And in 74, they said that Roe versus Wade was called it a sensible middle ground. Betty Ford a Republican. She hailed passage of Roe versus Wade as a great, great decision. Barry Goldwater, he was a great conservative hero of an earlier era. He supported liberalization of abortion laws early in his career, and his wife Peggy co-founded Planned Parenthood of Arizona. Can you imagine any spouse of a Republican leader today doing that? I mean, they just wouldn't survive politically. But, Phyllis Schlafly wrote a really fascinating book uh, titled How the Republican Party Became Pro-Life. And it's really worth the read. It shows that it was, when she started agitating against abortion, she was like pushing, it was an uphill battle for her. And they had to purge pro-choice voices from the Republican Party. It took a long time and a lot of effort, and it didn't happen overnight. It took about 15 plus years. But what it shows is that this idea of abortion as uniting the issue is a falsehood. And it's a fiction. It was created for political purposes. And I just want to say one more thing about misconceptions. I think people think that this is all about religion, and it's not. Religious nationalism is Christian nationalism in the American context is an anti-democratic political movement, and it's waging a political war against the foundations of American democracy.
Before we get into the money, the lies, and God a little bit, I want to go over some of the big players in the institutions that are part of this movement. You mentioned numerous ones at the beginning of your discussion. Reading the book, one that stood out, I'd like you to talk about a little bit, was the Claremont Institute, and how powerful they are, how many people have come out of there and gone on to position of powers. If you can kind of flesh that out a little bit for us.
Sure, thank you so much. The Claremont Institute was founded in Southern California. It's not affiliated with the Claremont colleges in any official way, although there has been some cross-pollination certainly in certain places, but not in any official way. It came together around a political theorist who was very charismatic. And in its earlier days, it was always conservative, but it saw itself as defending the principles of American democracy. They were really into Lincoln and trying to kind of understand how to be faithful to those America's founding ideals, the ideals of democracy, government of the people, by the people, and for the people, laws deliberated in public, laws that apply to everyone equally, including our leaders and other features of our democracy. And over the years, it really kind of took a different turn. And now it's become a kind of gathering spot for anti-democratic thinkers. They publish a couple of journals, and they have folks publishing in their journals who are, talk about who have said in various places that, they denigrate women, say that, giving women the right to vote was a mistake. Folks who are sort of spreading conspiracies about the 2020 election. John Eastman, who was identified as co-conspirator too in that big lawsuit, holds a position of enormous power in the Claremont Institute.
In the book on Claremont, again, you noted how the board of directors at the time of the writing was led by all men. I went back and looked at it again. It's still an all-men board of directors. Can you talk a little bit about the movement? And, it sort of has this fetishization of being manly and machismo. There's that one aspect of it, but yet there are women who are heavily involved in the movement, but why are they putting up with this, clearly, misogynistic dynamic?
Well, I think for some of those women, clearly some women are sort of raised in that environment and they don't, they're allying themselves with power, and what they have been led to believe is right. I mean, people allying themselves with power is very old. I think a lot of there's unfortunately, a number of women who would be willing to sell out the rights and humanity of other women for a seat at the boys' table. And you can see some of that dynamic with some of the women who have been allowed to appear in the Claremont, whose work is allowed to appear in the Claremont Review of Books, or who are adjacent to the Claremont Institute. But listen, I mean, let's just take a step back. I would have to say that our president's contempt for women is really not a secret. He has faced civil penalties for sexual assault, allegations of harassment from over 24 women. Many of his nominees for high office in the administration also face serious sexual misconduct allegations. Several have histories of misogynist and racist commentary. I'm thinking right now of Darren Beatty, who had his top job at the State Department that he was given, and he once declared that competent white men must be in charge if you want things to work. We we've had, the vice president has long argued that feminism was a huge mistake. Let's look at Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth, right? He has praised a pastor, Doug Wilson, who said it was wrong to give women the right to vote. And recently, when he drew those 800, all the generals together, you know, spoke disparagingly about women and people of color, and said we're not going to have like a woke military anymore. So all in all, I would say the presidency is shaping up to be a really an administration with a distinct hostility to women. So, the misogyny isn't limited to some of the folks at the Claremont Institute, like the most egregious offenders, like raw egg nationalist, or who said that, maybe women and men shouldn't be able to work in the same spaces. I mean, what does he mean by that? Hospitals should only be all male or all female? I mean, is he talking about segregation on the lines of, some of the, other fundamentalist countries that adhere to a different form of fundamentalism? Is that what he's admiring? But, I think it brings up a point. I think this kind of contempt for women isn't just a reflection of the kind of people who gather around our president. I would say that throughout history and around the world, gender hierarchy and male supremacy has supplied the backbone of authoritarian movements, right? It's not unique to America. It's not unique to our part of the world. I would say that authoritarian or fascist parties almost always glorify the virtues of manliness, by which they mean some kind of brutality. Unfortunately, they identify manliness with a kind of brutality. They see empathy as weakness. They despise it. They despise the supposed weakness of womanliness, which is how they interpret empathy and moderation and compromise. And in doing so, they're appealing to resentments of the disempowered, and they promise to dominate the objects of that resentment. And for a lot of folks, unfortunately, the objects of that resentment happen to be, related to sex, sexuality, and gender. So, this is a movement that also has like been focusing, its culture war issues on, um, I still go to right-wing conferences. Every single speaker talks about the issue of like trans, and, whatever you or I may think about those issues, they're not the issues that are affecting the bread and butter issues of the rank and file. They serve as distractions from the fact that, the dollar is failing. We have people losing their jobs. We've abandoned our dearest allies overseas. We've got a president who's enriched himself and his family to the tune of $3 billion by, through bribes and meme coin schemes, etc. But they feature this distraction because it's their way of claiming to protect women with one hand while taking our most fundamental rights away with the other.
You kind of alluded to it. Let's talk about money now. Someone else said this, but this phrase has always stuck with me, that an idea turns into a cause, the cause turns into a movement, and then the movement becomes a grift. There seems like there's a lot of grift in this movement. Talk about how people are making money off of this so-called movement.
Yeah, it's really shocking. I mean, it makes we've had political scandals, but it makes like Warren Harding with his teapot domes look like, you know, like child's play, right? And we have to remember, of course, that when Nixon attempted to subvert the Department of Justice, and it was released on secret tapes, he was ousted by his own political party. The Republican Party said, "You can't do that, you have to go." And today, Trump has openly declared that our law enforcement apparatus, Department of Justice, is there to serve his agenda and pursue his political enemies, the political opposition, which we are allowed to have in a democratic political system. And it's not even secret tapes. He announces it on Twitter, and his political party does nothing. But I feel like his political party has to wear blinders to not see or care about the fact that he is trading off the presidency, the highest office, in order to enrich himself and his family, whether it's meme coin schemes or social media grifts or palaces in the sky that he's accepting from Qatar, $400 million planes. His family wealth has jumped $3 billion in just a year, under a year, and it's shocking. And he has claimed to fight for you. He's been an effective messenger to a certain sector of the American rank and file, and they believe that he's fighting for them. And meanwhile, he's attacking rights for the workforce. Needless tariffs and needless trade wars are making it so much harder for so many of people in his constituents even to succeed. He's cutting projects in purple states and even in red states because he's declared that they're supposedly woke, or, but this is really about the agenda of the super wealthy. And I want to talk about that just for a minute. I think it's really important to understand that role of the super wealthy funders because they're increasingly driving the process, and their motivations are essentially economic. Now, some of them claim to have, religious motivations, and some of them do, or culture war motivations, but they're united in their economic motivations. I think what they have in common is a commitment to hard right economic ideologies. You've got, they want low taxes for the rich. They want minimal regulation of business. They want minimal regulation of the environment or no environmental regulations because a number of them are involved in polluting businesses or in energy extraction. I'm thinking about the Wilkes brothers, who are these fracking billionaires who are big funders, but there are others. They want to maximize fuel consumption or fossil fuel consumption because some of them are involved in extractive industries in that way. And they want to replace democracy with their kind of authoritarianism. But here's the interesting thing. A lot of them claim to be, free market people. We just want to let the markets do their thing. But at the same time, they're seeking privileged government contracts for their monopolistic businesses. They want competition squelched through, government features. A lot of them, think about Elon Musk. He takes billions of dollars in taxpayer subsidies. He, is, through his Doge scam, he's cutting, people's jobs, and yet he's awarding himself enormous government contracts. So, their claim to really just be about free markets and let's let capitalism do its thing ring kind of hollow. I think there's also a psychological aspect to this too, Michael, where I think a lot of Americans don't understand how wealthy the uber wealthy really are. Like the kind of sort of bubbles that they live in, the kind of islands they live on. the kind of like everybody's praising them and telling them how brilliant they are. And they develop this kind of, other people have named it founders syndrome. They really believe they have a right to set policy, right? They have a right to rule, and everyone else has a duty to obey. But from over the high walls surrounding their, magic castles, they can kind of hear the cries of their critics who say, "You really, you're impoverishing, you're eliminating mom and pops, you're eliminating the competition. You you really don't deserve to have, what does Elon Musk have now? $500 billion? Well, the average American is really struggling to make it work. This isn't great for America. And they don't like hearing that criticism. They resent it. And so they gravitate toward ideologies that will punish their critics and affirm the idea that they have a right to rule and everyone else has a duty to obey.
You mentioned the wealth factor and that there's a lot of wealthy people on the right, the uber wealthy. There's on the left, there are also wealthy people. In your book, I thought brilliantly examine the interconnectedness of the various right-wing groups and people and causes, and kind of flesh out the why, from what you've observed, why on the left does not seem to be nowhere near as effective as organized as the movement on the right.
That's great. And when we say left, let's just, acknowledge that we're talking about people who are sort of moderate, a true conservative to moderate to liberal to progressive to left. It's like a big tent, right? Um, I would say right-wing money and left-wing money tends to spend its money differently. Right on the right, they invest in people and organizations. So there's this infrastructure that has existed for many years outside of the Republican Party, but has sort of taken over it. I think for many years, Republican leadership thought, oh, great, we can make use of these folks. They're always going to vote in our favor. They turn out a reliable sector of the Republican vote. So, we got them on our side. And then over time and through this investment in organization, that movement has really taken over the Republican Party and the wheels have fallen off. Like, it's not the Republican Party that ousted Nixon anymore for something that, Trump does every morning before breakfast. On the left, there are a lot of wealthy folks, and some of them are doing fantastic work, but they tend to invest in, I would say, technocratic solutions. They think, wow, if we just, give this sector of people, food aid or do, job training, or if we can, develop, energy in this part, like look at what Biden did, for instance, with building alternative energy projects, putting them in red states and thinking if we bring great jobs to red states, maybe we can alleviate some of this resentment that people have, and maybe they'll vote in their, interests. And, sometimes left-wing money also invests in individual, say, politicians, which can be great, but those politicians, frankly, might not need the money. They might have a big enough war chest. And also, if you're investing in an organizational infrastructure, then if the politician loses and they connect with that politician, the politician loses their race, the money is still there. It's in the infrastructure. But if you send it to an individual politician and they lose a race, the money is kind of gone. So I think we have to acknowledge that people aren't always voting very rationally. They vote often less on policy than on identity. And if you can convince people that you're fighting for them and they're better than those people, whether it's the immigrants, the LGBT, the people of whatever that, people who aren't properly Christian, the woke Christians, as sometimes they're being called now, or people of different faiths or people who are not religious, you can, appeal to them in this emotional level, and that can be very powerful. It's interesting because people often accuse the left of playing identity politics, and that can happen for sure. But I would say that the right plays identity politics harder. You're with us, you're against us. You're one of us, you're one of them. You're pure versus you're impure. It's like this insider-outsider dynamic that otherizes and frankly dehumanizes a whole lot of Americans.
It's also frustrating for, as a Democrat, Democrats will send tens of millions of dollars to candidates in red states, like against Lindsey Graham. He's going to win in South Carolina, but we'll send $30 million to whoever the Democratic nominee is, and it get wasted as opposed to building organizations that
An
could have.
organization that builds a get out the vote machine. Look, in a country where
Yeah.
40 to 50% of people don't bother to vote, and an additional number of people are having their vote stolen through race-based gerrymandering, which is shameful, or voter suppression tactics, laws like you can't bring in, like an older person, a chair to sit on as they're waiting in line, or you can't bring people water as they're waiting in line in the heat. It doesn't take majorities to win elections. It just takes a disproportionately motivated and mobilized minority. I continue to believe that more Americans would rather live in a democracy with its flaws, but a democratic system, than want to live in a kleptocratic, autocratic, cronyistic state, religious nationalist state. I think that most American Christians reject the politics of conquest and division that this movement represents. And, I just want to note that I would say 40% of the talks I give are in houses of worship, churches, theological seminaries. There are Christians all over this country who are deeply alarmed by the weaponization of their faith and, really trying to understand it and figure out how to counter it. But the religious left, as we want to call it, mainline and progressive religious organizations, is not the equivalent of the religious right. They don't have the money, and frankly, they don't have the organizational capacity. I was just in conversation with a number of pastors from one of the mainline denominations, and they really don't want to get political in their churches. They're pastoring diverse congregations, and they also say, you know, Caesar, render unto Caesar, and render unto, our churches are really about talking about our religion and God and our religious values, and not about, they don't want to turn their churches into partisan political cells, which unfortunately has happened amongst a sector of the right.
That's true. I have one big question to ask, and then I'm going to open it up to the audience for their questions. The big question is, and I know you can't do this in 60 seconds because it's such a big topic, of how is the movement or the right wing using their power, money, and influence to undermine public education? We've seen that here in Arkansas with school vouchers and trying to dismantle public schools. Kind of walk us through why they're doing it and what they're doing.
Sure. I mean, the religious right has made public schools a flashpoint for the culture wars for decades. So I started researching this movement over 16 years ago, and my first book was in this about the religious right's efforts to infiltrate and undermine public ed. And it was clear at the time that the movement was really deeply hostile to the institution of public education, precisely because public schools are meant to be non-sectarian, welcoming all families, regardless of their religious background, neither affirming nor denigrating any particular form of faith. And they also teach children how to get along with others, including those who are different. Jerry Falwell made the agenda really clear in 1979. He said, "I hope to see the day when there are no more public schools. Churches will have taken them over and Christians will be running them." And other powerful religious right leaders echoed these talking points, people like D. James Kennedy and others. They said that public schools were brainwashing children in godless secularism. And we've heard echoes of this recently from groups like Moms for Liberty, which say they're teaching whatever, DEI, CRT. And I'm thinking, have you ever been to a public school? I mean, my kids, they're learning how to read and do math and learning state capitals and things like that. But I think what they're really upset about, well, two things. The first is they don't want public schools to be the centers of communities. They want their houses of worship to be centers of community. They don't believe that the government should be educating children, but they think it should be, they say it's all about, they want their schools, religious schools, to be getting government money. By the way, it's not that they are against government money going somewhere for education. They just want that government money to be captured by religious organizations. By the way, there are a lot of churches right now that are struggling for membership because our country, in some regards, is, you know, it's too simple to say that it's secularizing, but in some sectors it is, in some ways it's secularizing. A lot of folks don't want to go to church anymore or have been turned off by super political religion. And so these religious organizations know if they can capture a portion of the public funding for education, the money will flow without end. And we also know that once the money goes into a religious organization, it's no longer trackable by the IRS because religious organizations have certain exemptions that non-religious nonprofits do not have to adhere to. So the fundamental goal at the end of the day is to create a national network or national networks of publicly financed religious schools that explicitly favor conservative forms of religion and that can teach denigration of other faiths. I've looked at a lot of the religious schools that are receiving voucher money. Some of them, it's always fun to read a parent-student handbook, right? And some of these parent-student handbooks say things like, to be a good Christian, you have to be pro-life. And then they equate, homosexuality, bisexuality with bestiality and Satanism. In some of these parent-teacher handbooks, one of the parent-teacher handbooks I wrote about in my book, Power Worshippers, actually spoke about, male domination and female subordination and how that was like the right way for families to be organized. And they're a religious organization. They can do whatever they want because religious on that level, because religious organizations don't have to adhere to non-discrimination law on the same basis as non-religious nonprofits do. But this is one of the precise reasons why we have this notion of, church-state separation, is because religions are exempt from certain regulations and non-religious nonprofits aren't. But back to your point about public education, the language that they use to describe public education is really atrocious. They denigrate and undermine public ed at every turn, and they want to foster mistrust in public schools in order to pave the way for privatization.
All right, folks, I'd like to open up the floor to any questions. If you have a questions, we'll like to, if you can come up here, we can give the mic to you, depending on, just so Catherine can hear the question.
Thank you for your great research. This is very helpful information. My question is, I believe that you said near the beginning of your remarks almost an hour ago that using religious nationalism synonymously with Christian nationalism, I'm wondering if you could give us some bullet points or summary. How do the folks who espouse that point of view characterize religion? How do they see religion? Thank you.
So do you mind restating the question, Michael? I'm so sorry.
Basically, can you give the bullet points of how do they see the religion? Is that kind of sum it up? Yeah.
Right. Okay. Oh, I mean,
How they define religion?
well, I think the folks who lend their support to this movement, and I also said that not everybody who lends their support to this movement could be described as a Christian nationalist. I mean, unless people describe themselves as Christian nationalist, I would, or have espoused, as David Barton has, explicit, talking points to this nature. I would to these ends. I wouldn't necessarily call them like, an individual a Christian nationalist, but I think we need to understand that religious nationalism, like authoritarianism, or I would say Christian nationalism, like authoritarianism, is not just a set of attitudes embraced by the rank and file. It's a political dynamic that afflicts political systems. So I think a lot of listen, I've been in these spaces for many years. I see these folks worshiping with as much, I would say, passion and intensity as anyone. I would never say that they are not Christian, right? But this is, it's not for me to decide what is true Christianity and what's not. I mean, every religion is incredibly diverse. So, those who believe in the social gospel are themselves Christian, and those who denigrate the social gospel as woke Christianity, as some of the movement leaders, faith leaders have, are also Christian. Um, I hope that answers your question. But every religion, or I was, maybe not every single religion, but most religions, large religions, have a sort of spectrum of interpretation. When I was writing my first book, it was really interesting. In the course of my research, I met a fellow who contributed to a book called The Handbook of Christian Denominations. I can't remember the precise number of, he was a Nazarene, and, he was like, well, the Nazarenes, and this kind of Nazarene believes this. And he said, I can't remember the number of different denominations or variants of Christianity he and his co-writers identified, but it was astonishingly large.
Another question. Marvin?
Can you hear me from this position? Marvin, use this camera. In Arkansas, we're seeing an introduction of a poster on the wall of the Ten Commandments. It's going to be a school policy. Can you give us the trajectory of how this seemingly harmless episode or positioning of the Ten Commandments leads into the larger theories and politics that you've been identifying? Is this the opening, a gateway to such a reorganizing of schools?
Absolutely. Thank you for asking that. That Ten Commandments issue is actually part of an initiative called, it was called Project Blitz. I actually wrote about that, if you're interested, for the New York Times, May 16th. I'm sorry, May 26th, 2018. It is a plan that they had for advancing legislative goals in state capitals around the country. Their stated aim is to promote religious freedom, but it actually was really about blurring the lines of church-state separation, not just in public schools, but elsewhere in government. And they called it Project Blitz. The idea was to overwhelm state legislatures with bills based on centrally manufactured legislation. Like, do any of you guys know what ALEC is, the American Legislative Exchange Council? They do a similar kind of thing. They craft model legislation, and then they have politicians who are sort of favorable to their agenda adopt it and introduce sometimes identical language bills in different state legislators. And there were like 4 leaders of Project Blitz. David Barton was one of them. He is a kind of historian who promotes Christian nationalist talking points that he's, by the way, been accused of making up quotes that the founders never said. One of his books was actually redacted by his Christian publishing house. The first time they'd ever done that, it was called The Jefferson Lies. Thomas Nelson Publishing House, a religious publishing house, canceled the book because they said, there were problematic, factually problematic statements in the book, but it doesn't seem to have. He's got a big stature within the movement, and anyway, the Project Blitz had these templates, and the template bills were organized according to 3 levels of kind of severity, right? And these 10 commandment bills, like that was one of them, in the sort of first level. They basically said we want to have put 10 commandments in every school, every public school in the state, and sometimes in every classroom. And then they said, some of the bills said we want them in every police car, and we want them in every sort of state building. So that's why you see 10 commandments in your public schools, is because of the centrally manufactured legislation put out by Project Blitz.
Katherine, I'm looking at a room full of people who I think have enjoyed the talk, but I think I may speak for them. We might be a little bit depressed on all of these
sorry.
things. For the, in interest of time, I think we don't really have time for more questions. We only have.
But
time
I've got
stuff.
so much to
Could you,
say
could, no,
about.
no, but no, I want to, but I wanted you to leave us with some hope because you end your book on a note of optimism. Can you kind of walk us through why you are actually, even all this, still have some optimism about our future?
Absolutely. Listen, I take heart from the fact that those of us who believe in the values of equality and justice and want to sort of and appreciate the integrity of some of our democratic institutions represent a majority of the country, not a minority. I continue to believe that more Americans support democracy and its institutions over a kleptocratic, cronyistic autocracy. I also meet a lot of people every day who are out there working to cut through the disinformation, to try and alleviate the polarization and strengthen our democracy rather than tear it down. And now there's a lot of work to be done, but I refuse to believe that the work is in vain. I see hope as an action, right? It's not just a passive thing where you lay there and you just hope. It's something you do. It's a struggle for a better future. And that's an antidote to what we're seeing today. There are so many ways to get involved, and it's going to take every single one of us. We have institutions to protect, pro-democracy organizations to support. There are lawsuits to pursue. In many instances, the legal community is holding the line as best as we can. We've got corruption to expose. We've got midterm elections in just over a year's time. So, you know, we need to, if we want better outcomes, we really need to start learning how institutions have been undermined, spread the word, and really commit ourselves to the process of restoring them. I like to say that the concrete has been poured. The concrete for autocracy has been poured. It's being poured now, but it takes time for autocrats to consolidate their power. And the concrete has not hardened, right? We're still free to have this conversation. We're still free to write, to speak, to try to protect votes, to organize the vote, to sign people up to vote, and to collaborate. I think the most important thing is really to be engaged. Join a pro-democracy organization. If you can't find one you like, start one yourself. I'll just give you an example. I was in a state recently where I visited a woman who once a week from 5 to 7, she holds a kind of democracy building circle. It started with maybe 3 or 4 of her neighbors, and it now draws in dozens of people every single week. They show up at her house, and when I went, they were postcarding about a ballot initiative, trying to reach people in the state to let them know how to vote in a way that was going to not race-based gerrymander, right? It was going to be like, we need to do this, and then the next week it might be doing voter registration. And then there are other people who show up and gather some of her materials and go off because they have their own democracy building circles in their communities. And she wasn't given instructions. She just looked around. She said, I need to do something. And she's created this really important community-based activist network. And that's a kind of thing that anybody can do. But there are so many other ways to get engaged. Everybody can have a democracy building circle, whether it's yourself and 2 of your best friends or like this other lady. I think, I remember Ralph Reed saying, Ralph Reed is one of the movement's most, I would say, seasoned and astute strategists. And I try to go to his Road to Majority conference every year. Remember one year he said, pay no attention to the polls. Our numbers are shrinking. All that matters is who turns out on election day. And he is right about that. There's absolutely no substitute for the vote. It's really important to do a vote, not just in national elections, but also in local, state elections. And a lot of this stuff filters down to the local level. So it's really important to build, I would say at this time, support your local school district or your local public library if you can, or build a kind of community offering mutual aid and help people understand that democracy is really at stake. Freedom is not a guarantee. There are no guarantees, But if we look around this room, I can't see the room, but if you look around, I bet somewhere in the world, at some point in history, most of your relatives had had to fight for their freedoms. And if they can do it, we can try. And we owe it not just to ourselves, but also to our future generations. So I
Catherine,
want to
that was
thank you so
wonderful.
much for joining me today. And
Thank you. Please join me in thanking Catherine. Thank you, Catherine. We hope to see you in Little Rock one day soon.
hope so too. Thank you.
Thank you.